Hey everybody, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Beekeeping for Newbees. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen. I do appreciate you. And as always, feel free to reach out. You know the email address. I've said it 201 other times or something like that. All right, so I want to kick things off with a big apology to a group of listeners when I failed to adequately represent them. I mentioned the other day that about 90% of our listeners are from the US, Canada, and Europe, and that the rest of the world made up the remaining 10% or so, plus or minus. However, as I was reviewing the actual analytics over the past month, it was mostly accurate, but I do need to make a bit of a correction, or at least an update based on current metrics. So the listener ranking right now from most to least is US, UK, Canada, Australia, followed by Germany, making up 93.7% of all listeners. But next on the list, which is going to be ahead of all other European countries, is Vietnam. So good morning, Vietnam, and thank you for listening. And in case you want to know where your country ranks, rounding out the top 10 would be followed by the Netherlands, Sweden, Ireland, and Spain. So if you're not in the top 10, you might need to tell a friend. That wasn't supposed to rhyme, but that's just the way it worked out. Okay, so if you're just joining us or have not been keeping track or been halfway asleep at the wheel like most of us are all the time, this is Varroa Week here on the podcast. All 5 episodes this week are focused on the Varroa mite. Monday, we did the high-level overview. Yesterday, we went inside the cell and talked about how the mite reproduces. Today, we're going to get into the practical, kind of hands-on, at least the discussion part of it, obviously, about what needs to be done to actually make the assessment of your mite levels. And this is an area that's pretty important. You know, you can be doing everything right up to this point. And you make a shortcut, you do something wrong, and your numbers are off in a way that can make a really big difference. So we're going to get into that, and we'll talk about some different approaches and techniques. So let's start off with yesterday's hive report. We have colony 67 yesterday. It was an outside temp of 74 Fahrenheit, 23 Celsius. Slight winds, maybe around 10 to 15 miles an hour, and it was sunny. This colony is one of the other ones that I mentioned before that came in with the first group of 4 packages installed on April 30th, and it's in a 4-frame nuke with a feeder. The feeder was empty, so I went ahead and I removed that. I replaced it with a wax-treated plastic foundation in a wooden frame. I then moved one brood frame from the bottom up to the top, where I added a new 4-frame box. This was a tiny bit aggressive, in my opinion, but again, I'm trying to do some edgy things here in the apiary because I want to force different things to happen. And I think equally as important is I want to illustrate kind of the resilience of the bees. Even in the face of us making decisions that may not be the best, they still tend to find a way to persevere. And I want to kind of demonstrate that for you. So let's talk about why I think this wasn't the best idea. Several places around me have had frost warnings the last couple of nights, so we know it's going to get cold. Now, I do have a bit more protection where I am with the proximity to water, and the water tends to keep, the land a little bit warmer. But the dwindling population that we have with those packages of bees, we're at a point now where a lot of those original bees that came with the package, they're aging out. They are about to have a pretty sizable brood explosion. And I'm giving them a bit more space to heat, but more importantly, or even more impactful, I'm now forcing them to spread out to adequately cover the brood. And when I say adequately cover the brood, I'm talking about being able to keep them warm and make sure they're staying within the right temperature range and where they need to be. Now, when I looked at the way things were laid out within the hive, there was a single brood frame in the middle. It had brood on both sides. And then on either side of that, those frames also had brood facing towards the middle, but not on the outside. When I moved the one frame up, I moved the one that was on the edge that only had brood on one side. So, of course, bees are going to have to move up to cover that. But it was the frame that had the least amount of brood, and it was about 50-50 capped and open. But when I looked at the overall population within the hive and moving that one frame up, I knew that it would definitely divide some of those bee resources up and force some of them up to maintain good temperature over that brood. But it was still relatively warm during the day, and the nighttime temps were not supposed to get so cold to where I was going to be that worried about it. I think it introduces a little bit of risk, but not anything that I'm overly concerned with. The more conservative approach or way to handle this would have been to simply remove the feeder and then maybe take the opposite side frame that only had brood on one side and kind of slide that into the middle, maybe force a little bit more drawing of comb there, but they are almost out of space. I mean, they are pretty well packed out. And I think that because there are a lot of aging bees from the package, I've definitely got a little bit of latitude, but they are at a point where they are bringing in a lot of nectar, a lot of pollen right now. The queen is very active and they're pretty much out of space. And we would go from basically looking a little crowded this week to probably having the beginning of some queen cells next week. There's no need to take that chance. I'll give them a little bit of space in a worst case scenario, which definitely did not happen based on last night's temps. But in a worst case scenario, it gets too cold and you end up losing a little bit of brood. And I'm thinking that the numbers that were actually at risk was maybe like 300 or 400. So it's like a couple of hours of the queen's work. She would need to make up a few hours of time and they're back in business. I kind of took the gamble thinking that the space might be more of an important risk than a couple hundred brood. But I'll let you know in the next inspection where things are and if everything is still moving forward as planned. Now, the girls were a tiny bit feisty today, but they didn't sting me like their neighbor a couple doors down did yesterday. They were kind of bouncing off the hive tool a little bit. They bounced off my hand. They kind of hit the front of the veil a little bit. But like I mentioned yesterday, the kids are all growing up, and those sweet little packages that had nothing to defend are now becoming a bit more defensive, but again, not at all concerned with it. They were just doing normal defensive behavior. So they've got the space they need, and we'll keep you up to date. All right, it's time to get to work. Let's talk about figuring out whether you have a mite problem or not. Now, I want to start by saying that the answer pretty likely is going to be yes in some capacity or another. You may not have a problem today, but if you have bees, you probably have a few mites. So the question really isn't, do I have them? It's kind of how many do I have and are they problematic yet? Now, there are a few different ways to test. I'm going to run through a couple of those and, we'll see what kind of makes sense for you and your needs and what you want to do. The first one, which I would say is kind of the accepted best practice, gold standard, whatever you want to call it, is to take about a half a cup of bees. Now, I actually have an old measuring cup that just stays with all my bee stuff. And sometimes I can find it and sometimes I can't. But you're getting roughly about 300 bees. This is a good task for the kids. You can have them start to count all 300 of the bees to make sure you're getting an accurate sample before you start doing the test. Please don't do that. But the half a cup should roughly get you about 300 bees. It's pretty important to get those nurse bees, if possible, to get the most accurate measurement. So you're definitely targeting, I would start at the open brood phase. And if you don't find enough or you're having trouble getting them, you move over to other brood. So now we know how many bees we need to sample. The next part of it that introduces some challenges, figuring out how we get the number of bees we need into a sample container. So I'll start out with what I would say is the right way to do things, and then we'll talk about some alternative ways to do things. The right way is to, in one way or another, figuring out a method that's going to work best for you, find a frame, probably two, but at least one frame that's going to have some open brood. That's going to be ideal because the open brood space is where young nurse bees have most recently emerged, cleaned things up, because they are now nurse bees themselves. So they have emerged. They're a brand new honeybee in the hive. They start cleaning up the areas around them. The queen comes back through and lays eggs, and now they are caring for the new young and developing brood. Those are the bees you want. The ones that have most recently emerged from a cell are going to provide you the most accurate Varroa numbers. I would say probably the best way to do this is to get a regular tub, like a plastic tub that you would store things in. And you need one that's just about the right size diagonally. When you put the frame in diagonally, it's all you need. You don't need a huge tub. And I would take 2 frames. A lot of times 1 frame is enough, but if you have 2 and then they start, they'll start to disperse a little bit. But I put the frames on the hanger, I get them all ready to go, and then I will try to prop the tub that I'm using up against something just to already have, think about it if you had filled it with water and then you kind of propped it up on something, all the water ends up in one space. It's kind of that idea. I mean, obviously the bees can walk, they can go wherever they want to go. But when I prop it up, I can kind of shake them down to that corner. And then I would do the 2 frames, just quick, 1, hang it, 2nd frame, shake, hang it, take your half cup, scoop it in, throw it into your wash container, close it up. And at that point, you're done. Now, usually right there, once I throw them in there, I give a quick, a couple of shakes just to kill everything that's in there so they're not, sitting in the fumes, and I don't want them to suffer at all. You give a couple quick shakes, and then I immediately go ahead and grab the tub, shake it back over the hive, put the 2 frames back in, and then I go back and I continue on with the wash. That's kind of my approach. I do a little bit of a cheater approach sometimes, where once you kind of know what you're looking for, what that half cup of 300 bees looks like, the cheater method is basically hanging that frame on the frame hanger, putting a gloved hand on just to kind of help protect your hands, and without damaging the brood underneath, but in a relatively aggressive way, giving a couple of big pulls down across the frame, pulling them down directly into your container that you're shaking, your shaker container. And once you get that ballpark 300 number, go ahead and close it up and finish the wash, put the frame back in the hive. There's obviously a pro and con with that one. The con to it is you're not going to get a 100% accurate number, but the accuracy doesn't come from how many bees you select. I definitely recommend going over. Like if you go to 350, 400, even if you had to do 500, you just got a few too many in there. The greater the sample size, the more accurate your number is going to be. But, obviously you don't want to be killing a whole lot of bees either. But after you've done a few of these, you're going to have a pretty good idea what it's going to take to get to that 300 number. But if it ends up being 327, it doesn't change anything. You're still dividing by 3, and that's the numbers. The reason that I tell you that method, even though it's technically not the best method, is because sometimes at the beginning, it's the best you can get out of people. Everybody, and I'm not picking on people individually, I'm putting myself in that category. We as humans tend to try to find the path of least resistance, the simplest way to do things. And not having a tub to shake the frames into could be used as an excuse. Well, I wanted to do the wash, but I didn't have a tub to shake them into. It's like, all right, well, if nothing else, put them on the frame hanger and kind of sweep them in. Again, I don't think it's the best way to do it. I've done it many times. But to get the truly best number, shake them into something, measure your half cup. It's really, really easy to do. I'll do a video of it this year, and I'll show you guys how to do it. It's super simple. I'm not doing, this is actually something I forgot to mention. I am not doing them in my package bees yet. What I've done is when they got here, about a week later, I treated all of them with oxalic acid vapor. And then I treated again about a week ago. And I need to treat the swarm trap. I need to treat them within the next few days. I'm trying to remember. I got to double check that on the date. I think I'm good till Friday or Saturday before I need to treat them. But I'm trying to not take the 300 bees just yet because there is no brood space. There's nowhere for them to reproduce yet. So I've tried to knock down anything that came with them when they got, before they got to me. And then that first treatment was really just trying to knock down anything that came with them to me. The second treatment was making sure that anything that showed up between then and capping brood, that we've got anything knocked down that is inside the brood space already. And then I'll take my first sacrificial bees from these packages on 1 May. Now, as a quick math reminder, if you found 3 mites within your wash, you would then divide 3 into 300, and that would be 1. So you're at 1%. Different people have different thresholds for their management strategies. I know that if you are trying to breed for or assess Varroa sensitivity, people will let those numbers get a little bit higher for periods of time to see how the colony adjusts and to see what they can do with managing the mite themselves. I wouldn't just dabble in this. Like, if you're going to keep actual notes and you're going to keep detailed notes and you're going to really pay attention to things, and you want to try to selectively breed your queens within your own apiary to have some level of resistance, I think that's cool, and that's a good thing to try to shoot for. It's a fun goal, but don't do it haphazardly. Don't do it without the documentation and really keeping track. But for me, what I do is 2% is kind of my guiding number. If I see 3%, I'm going to go ahead and hit them with another treatment. 2 or less, I'm kind of fine with right now. As we get towards your August, September timeframe, I prefer 1 or less. I do not want those bees going into winter with any mites if possible, so I really want them to be sub 1. If I did a wash and I found 1 or 2 out of 300, I'd feel a lot better with that than going into the winter at or above those numbers. Now, I also want to pass along a little cheat tip that I haven't mentioned in the past, and the reason for this is that it does technically violate my recommendation of doing the washes both before and after treatment. And while that is how I do things, typically throughout the entire year, I do allow myself a little cheat. And I'm going to be specific. In early June, I'll do my standard, June mite wash. Now, sometime by the middle of the month is when our dearth is going to begin, where there is little to no resources available in the environment. This is where I'll usually treat at the end of June, and then I'll do a test on 1 July. So I'm staying on target for my July inspection, but I actually did a treatment right before it. And then if things aren't exactly where I want them to be, I kind of formulate the strategy around my next steps. Now, oxalic acid costs me about 10 cents per treatment per colony. So I don't mind giving that to them, prophylactically as a preventive. But what's nice is, let's say that I'm at like 2 to 3 mites per 100 on 1 July. I'll go ahead and hit them again, 5 to 7 days later. And then again, before the middle of the month, I'll do it again, and then I'll test on 15 July. Now, what I've done is I've cut out 2 washes. So there's basically 600 bees saved. I've done my treatments in close proximity to my previous ones. I don't have to worry about being aggressive yet because we're in a dearth. We have that brood break. The mites don't have a place to reproduce. But I know that right around the corner, that fall flow is going to start in August, and those numbers need to be 1 or less on 1 August. That's when I start planning to hit them hard. So I do not allow them to go into that fall flow with mites in the hive. Now, I've done situations where there have been, 3 to 4 treatments of OA, in succession over a 2-week period with success leading into the fall flow. And I've done some where that's not enough. And by that 15 August timeframe, I've got to really drop the hammer and get more aggressive. But with my local conditions, and again, with that 10 cent per treatment per hive kind of option at my disposal, it's hard not to use it a bit more liberally. And remember that there is no known resistance to oxalic acid, or at least there is not anything documented right now. Obviously, things can change pretty quickly. And I know that I'm getting a little ahead of myself on treatment stuff because that's not until tomorrow. But I do want you to remember that oxalic acid is really not great at knocking down high numbers. So you do need to act accordingly at different times of the year. Now, the other method that is used is called a sticky board. And the sticky board is used when you're taking a IPM board. Now, some people will actually buy the IPM board that is a corrugated cardboard, and it has a grid system set up. You put some kind of like a light oil on it, whether it might be like a cooking oil or a Vaseline or something like that. The idea behind it is you're putting something on the surface of this so that when a mite falls onto it, it sticks and can't and does not get away. and you can then later come back and count those mite numbers. Now, depending on who you talk to and what your treatment methods are and your goals and all these different things, you're going to hear different numbers from different people. Some will say, do a treatment and then check 24 hours later. Others will say up to 72 hours later. And what you do then is you count the total mites that have fallen within that time frame. And then you can say, okay, so based on the treatment method that we just used, we saw so many mites, and then you can convert that number into an approximate count. So what this is really great at, it is a really great indicator. It's not a definitive number. It's not a true diagnosis. There is some level of subjectivity to it when somebody says, yes, do it in so many hours. Well, like how long does it take for the first 5 or 10 to fall? How many of them don't actually fall all the way through? How many of them are removed? How many does a bee see dead somewhere, pick it up, walk it out? But what's really nice about it is non-invasive. You don't have to take a sample of 300 bees to gauge what's going on. Now, what I'm not going to do is review some of the numbers around what people will tell you, because there are definitely numbers out there. And someone says, if you put the board in place and you do a treatment and then you pull the board 24 hours later and you count the mites, as long as it's less than this number, you're good. From this number to that number, you probably want to take some action. And anything above this, you want to get more aggressive. Again, if that's a method and approach that works for you and you're comfortable with that, you can do that. But you have to understand, this is not the most accurate method. Now, what you could do, and this is what I really recommend, if you're interested in this approach, and I am not bad-mouthing this at all, I think it's a very, very good way of assessing things without having to kill the 300 bees. But my recommendation here is get the board in place, do your treatment. 24 hours later, come back, remove the board, do another mite wash, and then compare your numbers. So I'm going to make this all up, but let's just say that you were at 3%. So you had 9 mites in your wash, you did the treatment, and you counted a number. Doesn't matter what the number is. Let's say you counted 20 of them in there. So now, we'll make it 21 for easy math. So now you say you got 21 of them is equal to 3. So you say, okay, well, my mite count was 3, and there were 21 on the treatment. So it's a 7 times multiplier. So you know that whatever you see on the board, divide by 7, and that's going to be roughly your mite count. Now, that was a one-time shot, right? So do this again. If you have 5 colonies, even better. Do it on all of your colonies every time. Start with the mite wash, put the board in, do the treatment, do the mite wash again 24 hours later, and then compare with what you have on the board, and then find your dividing number. I said multiplier, but find your multiplier, divider, however you want to do your equation. Find out what that number is, and that's probably going to be a much, much better indicator than going by what Joe Smith says on his website, because Joe Smith counts them differently. He does his washes differently. He might do everything different from you, but he's giving you numbers based on what works for him. It's very much like everything in beekeeping, where something that I do regularly works great for me, and then somebody out in Idaho is like, yeah, I tried that and it didn't work. It's not that I'm wrong or that they're wrong. It's a different scenario, different place, different environment. Everything is different about it, and you need to kind of take that into consideration. The awesome, cool, super fun thing about beekeeping is that it allows you the opportunity to really explore a lot of ways to be creative and come up with new ideas and different ideas. So really avoid people who live in absolutes and tell you that this is the only way this can be done. I will give you one absolute that I feel very comfortable with is if you are not taking some kind of action against the Varroa mite, you absolutely will lose your hives. And the little asterisk I put down there is like, yes, if you have VSH sensitivity, you might, buy yourself a little bit of extra time here and there, but eventually it's going to catch up. Your VSH queen, she's going to swarm. The daughter queens that emerge are going to mate with local drones. You're going to lose that sensitivity. Like, things are just going to happen. So it's going to catch up with you eventually. So just make this as just something that you're just going to have to do. And it's the sucky part of beekeeping that you don't want to do. And every time you're eating that honey, just be like, it's worth it. This is definitely worth it. All right, I'm going to go through one last technique that I wanted to talk to you about, and that's going to be the sugar shake method. Now, if you haven't heard of this, basically what you're doing is you're taking powdered sugar instead of alcohol. And the idea here is you get to put the bees in and you do the shake and the mites fall off, which is cool and fun and very neat, and it doesn't kill the bees. Well, the problem with that is while it does dislodge mites, it tends to be less accurate. And then you end up with bees having SBS, which is a common bee illness known as shaken bee syndrome, and nobody wants that. There's actually a class action lawsuit coming together right now. But in all seriousness, you don't want to be just shaking the crap out of the bees, because while they may technically survive, I really don't think that they're ever going to be quite the same after that experience. So if it were really, really accurate, then I'd say, yeah, by all means do that. And maybe they'll survive a few more days to fight the good fight. But I feel like that's almost more abusive than just really quickly killing them in the alcohol. One thing I did forget to mention, and this is really important, I have no idea why it slipped out of my mind. I'm glad it came back before we wrapped up. What I've started doing a lot is moving the mite washes over to dish soap. So if you take like regular Dawn dish soap, and you do a tablespoon per gallon, and you use that in place of the alcohol, that works just as well as the alcohol does, and it's a fraction of the cost. The alcohol, the isopropyl alcohol definitely gets expensive when you have a lot more colonies and you're doing a lot more washes. Again, it's very effective. It works really well, but the dish soap works just as well from what I've seen. So I would definitely consider that as a alternative if you're looking to save a couple of dollars. And as we prepare to wrap up, I want to let you know that being on schedule is pretty much about as important as the method that you choose to use here. It's really important that you're staying regular. I would definitely recommend being on a once a month schedule. If the numbers end up being a lot higher than you expected, sometimes it can be because you have a whole lot of mites. Other times it can be you may have just had a bunch in an area where you sampled and there were just a bit more in that area. Either way, if you have high numbers, you do need to get aggressive with that. Now, we're going to talk again tomorrow, getting into the details of which treatments are less or more aggressive. But I want you to just kind of be putting that in your mind right now. Like, okay, if I'm getting high numbers, there is a solution. There's a way out of it. I don't need to freak out. But it's something that you want to be paying attention to. So regular testing, staying on schedule, taking appropriate interventions, all of those things are going to be important. So as a reminder, tomorrow is all about treatments. We're going to walk through the most commonly used treatments, how they work, how they're administered, and kind of how to think about or at least be considering a rotation so that you're not relying on the same thing, every single time. We do have some things that the bees have developed a resistance to. Now, I know people using some of those medications, and we can talk about that tomorrow, but they are using them still with effectiveness, but that just means that their bees have not developed a resistance. By doubling up or alternating, so anything that survived the first round with a previously known good treatment will now allow you to knock them down with that second thing. So you're really stacking the odds in your favor by having multiple solutions available, which we will talk about tomorrow. So take care, be kind to one another, and remember that I love you, and there's nothing you can do about it. We'll talk to you soon.